So hi everybody, thank you so much for joining tonight. We've got 21 people, but I'm sure there'll probably be more joining as we go, but I'll keep adding people in. So my name is Tamsin Fretwell and I work for Plantlife on the Magnificent Meadows Cymru project. So I'm just going to talk a tiny bit about the project, and then I'll pass over to our main speaker, Liam Olds from Buglife. So just to give you a small background to the Magnificent Meadows project. Hopefully I can move. Oh, come on. I'm trying to move my slide. Hooray. Okay, so whoops, oh sorry, oh dear, I'm making a pig's ear of this. So just to say that it's a Plantlife project, and we've got lots of different partners. I won't go through them all, but they're all there, and we are funded by the Welsh Government. So it's a 3-year partnership project from July 2019 to 2022, but we've had a few months of extension because of COVID. So we've got until December next year to sort out meadows in Wales. No pressure. Funded by the Welsh Government and match funded by National Trust, Plantlife and various other trusts. It has a Wales-wide scope, but in reality it's tended to be just in smaller areas rather than the whole of Wales, just because there's only 2 of us on the ground delivering the work. There's myself in Northwest Wales and Cassie, who's based in Southeast Wales. And previously it was Claire Flynn, who is based in Pembrokeshire. So it's tended to be in those locations, really, just because it turns out Wales is a really big country. When you're trying to do stuff across the whole country, it just doesn't work. And it has a Meadows badge, Meadows in the title of the project, but it's about grasslands, really. Meadows is just a much more sort of catchy title to give it. But yeah, we are covering all grasslands, and it's about trying to encourage people to restore meadows and species-rich grassland. And we've been working with all sorts of organisations. So for me, it's been really brilliant because I've worked in conservation for many years, and I feel like this project has had more impact than anything else I've ever done, because before I've been working like as a countryside warden managing nature reserves, whereas this time we've been working with hospitals, with schools, with housing associations, kind of people that I've never worked with before, and actually going out to them and encouraging them to change the way that they manage their grass, and with really brilliant results. Really had a really big impact, which is lovely to see. You know, seeing flowers blooming where there'd just been short grass previously. So yeah, it's been a really good project thus far. So as part of the project, we're working with Buglife. So I'll pass over to Liam Olds from Buglife, who is going to talk to us about meadow bugs.
Cool, thanks Tamsin. Just share my screen when you're finished.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, thanks.
I knew I had to do something. I shall mute myself. Oh, shall I just say, just while Liam's preparing that slide, if people want to ask questions, we'll have questions at the end. There is the chat option as well, but probably best to wait until the end. Thanks.
Thanks for that. Yeah, thanks everyone for turning up this evening to listen to our talks. So my name's Liam Olsen. I'm Conservation Officer for Buglife, which, if you're not familiar with Buglife, it's the only charity in Europe that's devoted to the conservation of all invertebrates. So everything from sort of marine slugs through to millipedes, beetles, bees, butterflies, everything really. Anything that's an invertebrate essentially is what Buglife are all about, sort of saving and sort of promoting really. So the idea of tonight really is to kind of sort of introduce, well, a little bit of a background on invertebrates, some of the issues with invertebrate declines, the role that sort of meadows play, why they're important for invertebrates, how we go about managing sort of these meadows better for invertebrates, because there's often a focus on plants with sort of little regard really for the invertebrates that are using those habitats as well. And then we'll sort of have a look at some of the other habitats that are associated with these as well, because they sort of meadows don't really exist in isolation. So you'll have other little habitats within and around a meadow as well. And then we'll sort of touch on then just some of the sort of common sort of invertebrate species that you might get in a meadow as well. And yeah, any questions, you can sort of keep them for the end and we can go through them. So just by way of an introduction really, so the UK is a small island nation, but we still got quite a lot of invertebrate species. We've got about 40,000 invertebrates. And I think it's somewhere around sort of 26 or 28,000 are insects. So just some of the examples here, so we've got everything from earthworms, still 27 species of earthworms, so probably more than some people think. You've got 650 species of spiders and 2,500 moths, over 4,000 beetles, over 7,000 flies, over 9,000 wasps. So the species diversity is still quite impressive, even though we're cut off from the rest of Europe, where the sort of species diversity even higher again. But all of these invertebrates play a really important role within the ecosystem. So they perform what we call ecosystem services, and these are free to us. So pollination is a well-known one. Seed dispersal is another one. They aerate the soil, particularly things like earthworms. They're involved in decomposition, so recycling, particularly in flies and things like dung beetles and that sort of thing. They're recycling nutrients, also linked to that decomposition. You've got the control of pest species. You've got things like ladybirds and hoverflies that perhaps feed on aphids. You've got food for us, perhaps less so in Britain, but you've got places like the Bug Farm in Pembrokeshire, which of course you can go and eat various insects. But in other parts of the world, insects are a big part of people's diet, and hopefully there will be more over here in the future. But they're particularly important food sources for other animals as well. So if you want healthy bat populations and bird populations and fish and everything really, then you really need to get your sort of insect populations right. And they're really good indicators for environmental health as well, because they got very specific environmental requirements. So they can be really handy really in telling you whether a habitat is in good condition or bad condition. So they're really important things. Hence Buglife slogan, saving the small things that run the planet. They do really do run the planet. And I'm sure a lot of you will have seen all of the sort of headlines that has been in the media, particularly in the last sort of few years. There seems to be a lot of sort of bad news stories really about plummeting insect numbers and insect apocalypse and ecological Armageddon and all these sort of things to do with the widespread decline of particularly pollinating insects like our bees and butterflies and hoverflies and moths, but also a wide variety of other things as well. And basically, there's a lot of our wildlife within the UK is in decline of our sort of insects. This is just kind of a graph from the sort of the State of Nature sort of kind of reports that kind of tell you kind of how things are doing. And this is just kind of just shows the sort of change in distribution of UK pollinators between sort of 1980 and 2017 when this graph was produced. And it just kind of shows that, there is this quite ongoing steady decline really from the late 80s. And in the sort of long term, about sort of 50% of these pollinators are assessed are in a strong, a decline of some sort, whether that's weak or strong. And then a lot of these declines are even more marked then in the short term as well. But it's not always clear cut really. So while things are declining. There's other things that are increasing as well, but a lot of the things that are increasing tend to be the more common and widespread species that are able to adapt to different environmental conditions, whereas some of them are habitat specialists, the rarer stuff can't quite adapt in the same way to a changing environment. And as I'm sure you've probably in other wildlife talks heard about some of the reasons for decline, but the declines in vertebrates are the same, really, the causes of it, as it is for birds and plants and other things as well. So habitat loss, it's a really big driver, and not just habitat loss, is the degradation of habitats, the fragmentation of habitats, and then habitats are becoming homogenized, so they're becoming simplified. And you particularly see that in agricultural settings, replacing diverse habitats with a monoculture of sort of arable crops, for instance. So habitat loss is a really big driver. There's also pesticide use, herbicide use and other chemicals. You've got invasive species, pests and diseases, urbanization, so a big push for housing developments at the moment. And you get, that's obviously eating up wildlife, wild habitats, and you've got the pollution that comes with that, and of course the fragmentation of habitats again. Climate change, which is a really big concern, and we're sort of seeing some of the effects of climate change on invertebrates at the moment. This is obviously something that's going to become more and more problematic as time goes on. And then all of these factors and other factors that I mentioned, they all sort of interact to sort of amplify really the effect on invertebrates. So it is a tough time for wildlife. And just, we're all here today really because we kind of want to sort of understand how we better manage meadow habitats for invertebrates and sort of try to address some of those declines. And that's why it's so good to have a project like this Magnificent Meadows that is trying to change the situation really and try to replace some of those meadows that have been lost over the last 60, 70 years in particular. But the first step really, I suppose, is trying to understand what invertebrates need. So invertebrates often have an annual life cycle, so just a single year, and then they have several stages then as part of this life cycle that we call instars. And some of these different stages can be reliant upon different environmental conditions and different environmental features or microhabitats and that sort of thing. And as a result, really, these invertebrates have these really complex and really specialized habitat requirements. And that's where habitat continuity is really essential for these things. So they really need the right conditions at the right time of year and every year, because if they're not there that one year, then that can wipe out that population. That's what makes these invertebrates so vulnerable. And they're also relatively immobile. So there are, of course, some that are highly mobile, but a lot of them are relatively immobile, which also makes them really sensitive as well to the environmental changes. So they can't often get out of the way of perhaps a pollution event, for instance, that would result in the sort of damage to their habitat. And sort of hay meadows, which some of you on this sort of talk will probably own or manage as part of volunteer groups, bits of meadow. And these are really important for a wide range of reasons. So not just the biodiversity, which is kind of what I'm talking about today, particularly with regard to invertebrates, but they're also an important store of carbon. They help to reduce the impact of flooding, which is obviously becoming more concerning with climate change. They emit fewer greenhouse gases because they tend to have lower livestock densities on them than sort of pastoral land. They also have lower fertilizer input as well. They're really important then for our health. So particularly, I suppose if you owned something like this, I suppose it would make you happy. And those sort of meadows that are in, that have got public rights of way through them, or in public spaces, then of course you've got that well-being benefit that's associated with seeing flowers and seeing wildlife, and there's obviously more and more evidence to show the benefits of being out in nature. They obviously bring colour to landscape, which is really good. They're a good educational resource, particularly when they're in school grounds and in urban settings. And of course, their importance to biodiversity. And when it comes to sort of invertebrates, the various sort of grasses that you get in these meadows, and it's important to note that having grasses in a meadow is good. You don't kind of want wall-to-wall wildflowers. Grasses are really important for a lot of the invertebrates, and a lot of the butterfly species feed on grasses as well. as larvae. So, grasses are important, but the range of grasses and the different wildflowers that you get in these meadows can accommodate quite a wide variety of different, particularly pollinating insects, but not just pollinating insects, but other insects and other wildlife as well. And hopefully I'll have enough time at the end just to kind of go through like some of the species and pictures here and just some of the kind of common sort of ones that you might expect in many areas. But before we kind of get onto that, I just kind of want to say about some of the threats to meadows. So there are lots of threats to them. Agricultural improvement is a really big one. So when you sort of the drainage of these sites are particularly important for our sort of like wet meadows, drainage can alter them and sort of reduce their quality. We've got ploughing, reseeding, fertilizer or slurry application, converting them to arable land, shifting from haymaking to silage production. All of these sort of agricultural improvement in inverted commas can be, a threat to these sort of wildflower meadows and the invertebrates rely on them. Abandonment as well. So they can be overmanaged, but then they can also be undermanaged. And if you just leave them, they can become quite rank and they can scrub over. I'll talk more about that later. Supplementary stock feeding can be a problem as well. So it can lead to the soil becoming more nutrient rich, which means less wildflowers, less floral diversity, and then of course less invertebrates. But it can also change the floristic communities in the meadows as well through the dung. But also you can get heavy poaching in areas as well, which can be quite beneficial in some regards. But then if it's too excessive, then that can be damaging as well. Of course, you've got your application of all chemicals like herbicides and pesticides. They can have an effect directly on invertebrates, but also changing those plant communities again. Heavy grazing pressure, so overgrazed can be bad because of course you're removing those plants before they have a chance to flower. And again, you kind of end up with generally with a more sort of grassy habitat, and you kind of lose the floristic diversity. Changing the timing of hay cutting as well. So, I think things are getting better, but, there has been quite a lot of, in the past, hay cutting is done, when the sort of the flora are in kind of full flower. You kind of really want to wait for things to go over and set seed and hopefully sort of wait for the invertebrates to kind of finish doing their thing really before you kind of do these hay cuts. So you kind of want to be doing them as late as possible. And lowered water tables as well. So, so a lot of meadows, might be sort of drains might be installed to dry them out, or they might be changed in other ways as well. And that can all affect meadows and the sort of wildlife associated with them as well. So when it comes to sort of managing specifically for invertebrates, there's a number of kind of key things really that you want to kind of aim for. And structural diversity is a key one. So as well as species diversity, so you want to want as greater diversity of grasses and plants as possible. But you also want to try to, encourage structural diversity. So you want to try to achieve like a mosaic of different sward heights. So you want this gradual transition really from shorter vegetation through to longer vegetation. And that's kind of one of the issues, I suppose, when meadows are managed by sort of mowing. You kind of tend to get a uniform sward height, which isn't ideal really. Here's just like a picture of a meadow. This is actually on an old coal tip. So this is a Brownfield Meadow, but the same size really. But you can kind of see that there's in the foreground a bit more, particularly so foreground to the bottom right. You can see that where the sward is quite open there and quite short, and then it sort of grades up then to this longer vegetation, and then eventually works its way back to scrub then as well, which is scattered scrub is really important. But not entirely scrubby, but scattered scrub is really important as shelter for things. It might, if it's flowering shrubs or scrub, then that's important as a pollen nectar source as well. There'll be things feeding directly on the leaves of those trees and scrub as well. So, but yeah, you basically want to aim for structural diversity. One is like almost like a messy kind of look to it, I suppose. You kind of want areas of short sward grassland, bare ground, then grading up to longer vegetation as well. And it tends to be the sort of, medium to tall vegetation don't quite know how you define what medium is, but sort of not really tall, but kind of in between. That tends to support the most sort of invertebrate species. The short sword tends to be a bit sort of fewer invertebrate species, and a little bit more of the specialist stuff usually kind of requires the more sort of open bare ground and really kind of short sword vegetation as you get when you've got sort of close mowing or close grazing. As I mentioned, scattered scrub and hedges can be really important, particularly if they're in sunny positions. And then you'll have added diversity as well when you consider things like you might have banks or footpaths or tracks as well, kind of going through these grasslands. But it's basically, trying to achieve structural diversity, because you've got to think of invertebrates as in the sort of micro scale, I suppose. So these are small things and they rely on micro habitats. So you want to basically get as many micro habitat features as possible. And basically open bare ground is one micro habitat, short sward grass will be another micro habitat, tall sward will be another one again. So you've got to think more broadly than just a meadow as one single habitat. You've got to kind of think of it as miniature habitats to make up that meadow, and hopefully that kind of makes sense. And how you kind of go about achieving this structural diversity. So livestock grazing tends to be the best way to do it. So particularly light grazing. But stock density is really kind of crucial, because as I've touched on before, overgrazing can be really damaging as well. And there'd be some of you on this talk tonight that probably haven't got ground large enough to have livestock on it, but then some of you might. But if you do have a larger sort of site, you might own livestock yourself, then you could sort of divide the site up into sort of, subdivide it up really into sort of different sections, and you can alternate the grazing between these different sort of patchworks. So you're varying the grazing pressure, so you're not getting, sort of horses on one patch all year and just eating it to death, for instance. You can move them around and allow areas to recover, and for the flowers to come up and perhaps set seed, and then moving the livestock around. And it's just kind of what realistically works for you really in the best way as to how you do that. The choice of grazing animal is important, and generally cattle tend to be the best for this sort of management, but it might not always be feasible if you're a landowner to get cattle. But cattle are really good because they tend to graze less evenly than sheep and horses as well, and they disturb the ground a bit more, which you won't if you haven't got loads. You're not going to get really heavy poaching in the ground then, but that bit of poaching is really quite important, and it sort of just adds a little bit more of those microhabitats. You get those bits of depression where the hooves are gone in, and little bits of scrapes, and they might fill the water, and you think of those kind of little microhabitats that you get as a result. But they're also kind of important because they deposit it down quite randomly across the area, and they tend to avoid grazing around their paths as well. So you kind of get this sort of patchwork across the site then of like longer vegetation where it's sort of grown up around the paths, and then obviously shorter vegetation where they've been grazing as well. So they naturally create this patchwork in the way that they graze land as well. So cattle can be really good, and it's why cattle tend to be the best for conservation grazing in wildlife projects as well, particularly things like highlands. It is an important consideration when you have livestock of any form, whether that's sheep or cattle or horses, to think about the when you're worming livestock, because the wormers that are given obviously to livestock, they pass through into the dung, and this is kind of a growing concern really, and I think is going to be the next sort of hot topic really when it comes to sort of wildlife decline, is the effect that we're having on the environment with these sort of internal parasite sort of treatments that are given to livestock. And what basically they contain a lot of these active ingredients, like ivermectin is probably the best known one, but there's this, as you see there, moxidentin and doramectin and a lot of these other active compounds, and these basically pass through the livestock into the dung, and so it ends up these dung pats or whatever it is, sheep dung, horse dung. They can contain these really harmful chemicals. So we generally try to advise sort of animals being kept off site for at least sort of 10 days after treatment. So if they're sort of housed within, indoors, then to try to sort of wait until those harmful sort of chemicals are passed through the body before taking them out onto the meadows, onto your grasslands. So they're not kind of getting out in the environment and affecting dung beetles, which is what I'm going to talk about quickly. And also to try to avoid these slow release wormers as well. So you really kind of want the wormers to kind of go through the livestock and get out as quickly as possible. And when they're slow release, then they're being released over a longer period of time. It's almost better to get them out all as quickly as possible, I suppose, rather than having them in the environment for a long time. But the big concern really with these these wormer treatments is that their effect on dung beetles in particular, but not just dung beetles, but other things as well. There's quite a lot of different insects that develop within dung, but particularly their effect on dung beetles, because what's been found, a study last year in particular, is the most recent one I'm aware of, found that both adults and the larval stages of our aphodony dung beetles, which are our most common and most species diverse dung beetle groups within the UK, they're significantly reduced in abundance in dung that contains these harmful chemicals. And also the adult dung beetles are attracted to dung that contains these wormer treatments. So it's actually drawing in adult dung beetles, and then both them and their larvae are getting killed within it. So they're acting as a population sink. So it's really quite concerning, particularly when you think about how important things like dung beetles and other things are for bats in particular, more so than anything, but also birds and wildlife as well. And I'm not an expert on this, but there are experts out there that have a farming background and kind of also have the entomology background as well. But I would say to check out Dung Beetles for Farmers website, and that's quite a recent sort of website that gives you a little bit more information about the best way forward, really. And it's run by Sally Ann Spence, who's a sort of entomologist and farmer herself. So it's that good linking of the two different sort of industries, really. So not, as I mentioned, not all sites will, be able to have grazing livestock on them, particularly if they're urban sites or quite small. So those sort of sites then could be managed by cutting. And as I touched on earlier, the mowing can result in this more uniform sward height. So you don't get that structural diversity that I've been talking about is so important for invertebrates. So the way you can get this structural diversity through cutting is really to cut on a rotational basis. So you could cut one section one year, leave the other section and do that the following year and rotate it round. Basically dividing the sites up. If you've got a site, then you can divide it up into area 1, 2, and 3, for instance, and you cut 2 and 3 one year, but leave number 1, and then the next year, you cut 1 and 2 and leave 3, and just kind of keep doing that, really. So that can be a good way of doing it. You can also vary the cutting height as well, and frequency across the sites. You could cut part of it quite low, and then you could higher or lift the height of whatever you're using to cut it, then to have some sections cut at a higher height and kind of vary that as well. And what these will do really is create this patchwork of different sward heights. So it's basically kind of almost mimicking livestock in the way they kind of graze. So graze some areas a bit more and then leave other areas. And it's basically just getting that diversity at the sort of landscape scale. Of course, it's important to remove cuttings as well, because that will just sort of add nutrients to the soil. You kind of want to keep depleting the soil of the nutrients in order to encourage more and more species diversity, floral diversity. And what we always aim to suggest really is to leave some areas in cut. So you always got some areas in cut in any given year. So it might be entire sections if you're able to do that, or it might just be a corner or a patch basically somewhere on site, or it might be the margins. So you get margins are becoming more and more common now, where perhaps you cut the rest of the field but leave one margin on one side or something along those lines. But basically by trying to sort of leave some areas totally untouched, you create this refuge for invertebrates. So it allows these invertebrates that are overwintering in the sort of dead stems of like knapweeds, for instance, or hogweeds or something like that to survive. Or they might be overwintering the old seed heads. So it's basically giving them a chance to survive, whereas normally you'll be removing all of that resource for invertebrates, and all of a sudden you've gone from habitat that would have quite a lot of invertebrates to absolutely nothing straight away. But they're also, these sort of uncut areas, they're also important for sheltering and overwintering as well, particularly where it's a bit more tussocky. So species will be looking, that for those that overwinter as adults, they'd be looking for places that will be safe, somewhere that they can sort of hide for the rest of the winter, really, until next spring. So really try to aim for these uncut areas if you can. And of course, if you sort of do a cutting on rotation, you will cut those uncut areas in the following year. So you don't have to kind of worry about them scrubbing over. So we're not saying leave them uncut permanently. It's just sort of leaving them uncut for a single year. And then the next year you might leave a different section uncut, and keep doing that. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And try not to avoid cutting the entire site all at once. So the way kind of is generally done with meadow management is cut the whole site all in one go. But you're just removing all of the resources really for invertebrates. So even when flowers go over, there'll still be invertebrates, within the stems of those plants, or feeding at the roots, or feeding in various different places, or overwintering and that sort of thing. So you kind of want to try to maintain some of those you can. And also it's really important to delay cutting to as late as possible. So the later the cut, the more time really invertebrates have had to really complete their life cycle. And it's also better then because you give plants more time to set seed. So you will get, better floral diversity in your meadow as well. So they're the sort of main sort of things I would say. Cut on rotation, leave some areas uncut daily in any given year. Don't cut all in one go, and delay cutting for as late as you possibly can. And basically that's how you kind of achieve best really for invertebrates. And here's just kind of a classic example of a meadow that's obviously been managed by cutting. You can kind of see it's all kind of uniform sort of height really, apart from the course of footpath has been mowed through the mill. But you haven't kind of got that structural diversity really, with the really short sward bits and the longer bits, and everything kind of in between is all kind of that standard height, which will reduce its quality for invertebrates. The more structural diversity you've got, the more species you can get on your site, the more habitats you're providing and microhabitat features. But it is quite an important consideration just to say that there is no damage-free mowing technique that exists out there. So no matter what you do in terms of mowing and cutting, it will impact on invertebrate populations, both directly, so you can obviously directly kill them, or indirectly, because you're moving the food resources that they might need. So you've just got to try to think about ways to minimize that as much as possible. And this is an area that kind of really needs a lot more research at the moment. I'm not aware of any guidance out there that really kind of tells you about what you should be using to cut in and what's the best for invertebrates. But as a general rule, it tends to be that conditioners and mulchers really do increase invertebrate mortality. You want to try to avoid using conditioners and mulchers as much as possible. Rotary mowers can be really destructive to invertebrates because they have the tendency to suck up material and then macerate it into little tiny fragments. You can imagine if you actually got invertebrates within it, like grasshoppers and crickets, or if you've got eggs or other larval stages, you're obviously just shredding them essentially. So they tend to be, something you want to try to avoid if possible. And what has been suggested is the use of these finger bar or scythe bar mowers. And if I understood it correctly, I think they cut basically like a scythe would. I think they just kind of do like a single cut and not kind of suck it up and into a spinning blade and macerate it on tiny little fragments. So they obviously limit the damage because it's just that single cut, and it's not going through a big blade and being shredded and shredding invertebrates at the same time. If you've got a smaller site, of course you can do some with a hand scythe, and that'd be obviously the best kind of way to do it, where we really kind of reduce the impact on invertebrates as much as possible. But of course that's not always practical, because I kind of know how much time it goes into hand scything, and if you've got a massive area, it's really impractical. But for small sites, that would work. But otherwise, kind of looking to invest in these finger bar or scythe bar mowers would probably be the way forward. You also want to be kind of looking to minimize input. So I mentioned about some of the impacts that pesticides and herbicides and all of those things can have on grasslands by changing the floral communities. But they can also obviously directly affect the way that invertebrates function and directly kill them as well. But they can also change the mycorrhizal sort of fungi in the soil, and fungi are really important for the plants. So if you sort of are affecting the fungi in the soil, then of course you're affecting the plants, and then in turn affecting the invertebrates as well. So you're just trying to really minimize or avoid the use of these chemicals wherever you can. It's a really key thing going forward. And I've touched on the livestock a bit, but try to avoid giving supplementary feed as much as you possibly can on these really kind of unimproved pastures, so these obviously species-rich hay meadows, as this will increase the nutrient input that goes into these meadows and change the floral communities as well. But I do understand that it can be quite challenging to achieve some of these things sometimes. I've touched on scrub a few times, but the scrub is really valuable, and it tends to be sort of vilified a bit, but scrub is really important, and you do kind of want scrub. It's just about ensuring that the grassland doesn't become dominated by the scrub, and particularly around grasslands as well. But as you can see in this image, this is just a classic example of, you've got, gorse and other scrub just creeping in, and every year it creeps a little bit more and a little bit more, and eventually you're kind of left with quite a small parcel of meadow, whereas before it was obviously a much larger. So you basically want to keep that scrub in check. So creating almost little islands of scrub is quite good, or having a bit of scrub in the corner, but not letting it go too far into the fields and that sort of thing. But good to have the scrub, but just keep it in check is the kind of main point really with that. You also want to sort of maintain the hydrology. So this is more aimed at sort of wet meadows. So when you're talking wet meadows with lots of dells, scabious, for instance, floodplain meadows, anything like that, you kind of, they tend to have quite rich floral communities, but particularly quite rich invertebrate communities as well. And there's special invertebrates that are sort of developed or evolved, I should say, to get used to this seasonal indentation. So they're used to this seasonal flooding. So you kind of want to maintain that varied hydrology as much as possible. So you want to try to avoid draining these sites, because they're really important as they are, and basically just allow the natural sort of flood regimes to continue as they are. So if your field does flood up for several months of the year, and it always has done, then the invertebrate communities there will be adapted to those sort of conditions. You kind of want to keep those going into the future as well. You also kind of want to keep any other sort of hydrological features as well. So it might be things like little seepages, or you might have ponds, you might have ditches, and there might be other little micro habitat features that I have mentioned as well. You want to retain them as well, because they'll be, particularly in terms of seepages, there's specialist invertebrate communities that are associated with the seepages, and then they might be acid seepages, or they might be neutral seepages, or calcareous seepages, depending on what the soil is. So these are really important, really, just to maintain all of these hydrological features on a site. So it's all about, again, the habitat diversity is really key, and about getting as many of these little microhabitats as possible on the land you own or manage. So that was just a bit of a kind of run through about meadows in particular, and some of the kind of ways to sort of better manage them for invertebrates, but also with plants. But as I sort of mentioned at the start, I was going to cover really about other habitats, because meadows are part of these larger habitat mosaics, and can't really think of a meadow on its own, because it links up with other habitats around it and is equally as important as some of these surrounding habitats as well. So a really kind of key one, and one that many of you will probably have around a meadow that you know or manage, would be hedgerows. So hedgerows are really quite key. You might have old trees as well, particularly growing in the hedgerow, but you might even have some out in the open. You've got a bit of like a wood pasture sort of habitat. You might have broadleaf woodland on the edge of your meadow. You might have scrub, which we've covered a little bit. You might have an orchard as part of your site. You have all your various wetlands. You might have a pond, you might have streams, rivers, springs, flushes, ditches, all that sort of stuff. Banks, so you might have hedgerow banks, but you might have other banks as well, which can be important for nesting. particularly nesting solitary bees and bumble bees and that sort of thing. You might have farm tracks, which are really valuable. So you might have things like green tiger beetles that are, nesting and sort of hunting on those sort of open bare ground on the tracks. You might have quarries, which are just all brownfields tend to be brilliant, but quarries can be really good. Dry stone walls, which are important as shelter for invertebrates, and overwintering sites as well. So these are all just like some of the different things that you might have in and around your meadow that are important for invertebrates and wildlife as well. And many invertebrates, they require 2 or more habitats to complete their life cycle. So that's when you kind of got to think a little bit outside of just meadows, and why it's important to, have your hedgerow in good state, or you have your old trees with dead wood, or you have your ponds and that sort of thing. So more habitats you have, the more invertebrates again you can support. And so habitat diversity is really the key. And as I've sort of already touched on, is diversity both within the habitat and between habitats as well. So it's the diversity within your meadow in terms of that structural diversity and those little micro habitat features, but then also the diversity in the broader habitats like woodland and wetlands and bare ground and sort of old trees and all that sort of stuff. So I'm just going to kind of touch on just a few of these sort of key habitats, I suppose, and just touch on how you kind of manage them in the best way for invertebrates. In water, I've obviously talked a bit about hydrology and why it's important to maintain these sort of wetland features, but many sort of pollinating insects in particular, but also other insects, spend at least part of their life within water. So some of our most common hoverflies, like on the bottom left, one of the drone flies or Aristalis, these you see these really commonly, they're important pollinators, but their larvae actually develop in wet pools and ponds. You kind of see how you gather pollinators aren't always associated with terrestrial habitats, they're associated with aquatic habitats as well. So water bodies of any size really can provide some sort of larval habitat for invertebrates, and also attract other wildlife, of course. The wetland flowers around them tend to be really important for pollinators. You've got, things like your water mints, Bumble Bees absolutely love them. Purple loosestrife can be really good. Willow herbs, meadow sweet. And the list can kind of go on and on, really, about wetland flowers and why they're important. Umbellifers, like the hogweeds and hemlock water dropwort is all really important plants. But the water itself, of course, is important for thirsty insects. And things like ditches can act as quite important wildlife corridors through the landscape as well. So firstly, starting on ditches and ponds. So I mentioned that, I wouldn't kind of want people creating ditches to drain land that perhaps was already of important value if it was a nice wet meadow. But if you've kind of already got a ditch on site, then they can be important wildlife sites as well. And with these ditches and also with ponds, the management again should be on a rotational basis. So about 2 to 5 years. So it's not about sort of, dredging the entire ditch all in one go in the same, in the same year. And it might be the same with the pond. You kind of want to do it on rotation. So dividing it up into sections and do one section 1 year, next section the next year, and just kind of keep doing that. So that's, again, it's just ensuring that there's always some habitat available for invertebrates to complete their life cycle. So you're not removing all the resources they need in order to survive, because as I mentioned, invertebrates have got this annual life cycle, so they need the right habitat conditions present the right time of year every single year. So that one disastrous event like dredging an entire ditch or dredging an entire pond, can wipe out an entire species from that site. You also kind of want to try to delay any work you do on ponds and ditches and other water bodies until as late as possible. So I've said here after the end of August, but basically as late as you possibly can, just to allow invertebrates to complete their life cycles and any sort of flowering plants around the edges to sort of set seed. When it comes to creating ponds, or if you were looking to create a ditch, particularly ponds, it's important to not have these sort of really sharp sort of edges, basically the shelves. You kind of want this gradual sort of gradient, I suppose, going into the water, because you get this then transition really from the wetland habitat to the terrestrial habitat. So you get this nice sort of intermediate boundary really from when it goes from dry to very wet. So you kind of get this, and there's a lot of invertebrates that are associated with this sort of terrestrial to aquatic transition zone, particularly ground beetles and some flies as well. And worth noting that cattle trampling can be quite beneficial around these ponds to create a bit of bare earth and bare mud, which some invertebrates need, but you kind of want to be kind of careful about too much livestock, entering the watercourse and being around that edges and really kind of churning it up and getting it kind of really muddy. And of course you want to avoid livestock, definitely getting into the water as well, and, in creating those algal blooms and, sort of inoxic conditions or lack of oxygen and things like that. And of course, if you don't have some of these features, then if you can look to create a little ponds and pools and things like that, or little scrapes that can become seasonally inundated with water, then that's all really beneficial going forward as well. Of course, you might be wanting to manage more for the flowers and the grassland, but there might be an opportunity in an area, in a corner perhaps, where maybe the flowers aren't quite as good, that you might be able to create like a little pond and might not be too much trouble yourselves. But that's a really useful thing to do, is add in water bodies. And if you've got these water bodies as well, you'll often have trees around them, and just trying to ensure that these trees don't entirely shade the water body is important as well. So some shade is really, really good, particularly if you're thinking during like really hot conditions, and both invertebrates and fish as well can kind of get into the shadier, cooler areas. But a lot of the invertebrates really do need sunshine on the water, so you kind of want to ensure that they don't become entirely shaded. So partial shade, but not entire shade, is really key. Hedgerows is another really key habitat, and this is really important because hedgerows provide food. So particularly if they got flowering trees in them, things like hawthorn, blackthorn, willow, that sort of thing. They also provide shelter. So you can imagine shelter during storms, during the winter, or just rain generally, and also during drought. They act as overwintering sites, so nice hibernation sites for things like Bumble Bees, for instance. They act as these important linear corridors in the landscape as well. So hedgerows tend to be linear features. So you've got these opportunities for things to move through the landscape by following hedgerows. Where you've got, sort of flowering shrubs, trees, ivy, they're really important part of the blossom sequence. So considering the blossom sequence is quite key. You want to try to provide food throughout the season. So you want to try to get everything flowering from really early in the year, which tends to start with more of the willows and the blackthorn, right away through then to your sort of field maples and your sort of hawthorn, and then keep following that through, then eventually ending up with the ivy right at the end. So you kind of want to ensure that you've got those food resources throughout the year. As I mentioned, they're important shelter from the wind and during droughts and storms. The hedge banks themselves are quite valuable, particularly if they're quite sunny and sheltered out of the wind, because that's where you'll tend to get your solitary bees, like your mining bees nesting. You'll also have your bumble bees, that a lot of them are ground nesting and nesting empty mammal burrows. So they tend to use mammal burrows in the hedge banks. So it can be an important place for your bumble bees. And these hedgerows tend to have flowers underneath them as well. So you tend to get a lot of sort of like hedge woundwort and other plants along those sort of hedge boundaries. And these are important pollen and nectar sources for invertebrates as well. And of course, these hedgerows can sometimes contain old trees, and there's perhaps not as many old trees in hedgerows as there used to be. But where they've got nice big old trees, then you'll have dead wood, and a lot of pollinating insects develop in dead wood, and a lot of other things as well. So it's just about, again, that diversity. When it comes to managing hedgerows, it's basically the same sort of points really made over and over again, really, is that you kind of want to avoid cutting the hedge all at the same time on a single site. You want to try to cut on rotation again, so leaving some areas uncut, but then obviously cutting them the following year. And basically this will just ensure that if you've given these sort of hedge plants time to produce flowers and berries, and ensuring this continuity of food resources for invertebrates, but also wider wildlife as well, like birds. You want to try to retain some of the strong sort of saplings in hedgerows to ensure you've got some of those really large trees that are going to provide the future deadwood habitats. So that can be quite key if you've got that opportunity to leave some of the stronger ones grow nice and tall, or perhaps look to plant some trees in the hedgerows, particularly if you've got gaps. And when you sort of looking to plant new hedgerows, if you haven't got a hedgerow on your site or it's not in the best sort of condition, then it's obviously just trying to use trees that are appropriate for the local landscape. So obviously have a look to see what flowering trees there are in your area and try to get those same ones, but then just try to look to get the longest blossom sequence possible, really. So try to get a different sort of hedge plants that flower at different times of year, just so you've got that, the sequence throughout the year, and there's always food available for particularly the pollinating insects. So so the food throughout the season. So it starts really in spring with the trees and the shrubs are really vital at that time of year in spring. And particularly things like willows or sallows, or whatever you want to call them, they're really important for some of our really early pollinators, like our queen bumblebees. When they just emerge from hibernation, they tend to go straight for willows because they're high in pollen, high in nectar, and they can build up their fat resource, and it's also the first thing that's really flowering that early in the year. This is when really the hedgerows come into their own, really, and these sort of orchards as well, and things like that is really in spring. And then as you go through in summer, that's when your meadows become more important, where you've got all your various legumes like your birds with trefoils and clovers and your hawkweeds and hawkbits and other composites like that. And you've got your umbellifers as well, really important. You also have bramble, so it's important not to vilify bramble too much because it's one of the most important plants for invertebrates, bramble, as a flowering resource, but it's also species that nest in bramble as well. You've got things like little yellow-faced bees that nest within the actual dead stems of brambles and things like that. So having some bramble on site is really key, and it causes additional sort of shelter and overwintering sites again. Later in summer, then you tend to get more of your thistles and your hogweeds and your teasels becoming important in meadows. A lot of the plants that are often quite vilified by farmers are really important for invertebrates, like the thistles, for instance, and ragworts. And then as you get into autumn, then obviously things are dying down, but this is where ivy then comes into his own. And if you've got devils with scabious, then that's obviously flowering this time of year, and it's really important as well. But basically try to provide as much food as possible throughout the season. So that's why it's important to encourage a wide variety of different plants in your meadow, because then naturally you'll get plants that are flowering at different times of year, but then ensuring you've got the blossom sequence in your hedgerows as well is really quite key. I also kind of realized that I'm supposed to be talking about monitoring invertebrates as well, so I'm just going to kind of touch on that quickly before we finish. And when it comes to monitoring invertebrates, you might want to monitor kind of how your meadow is developing, maybe how it's changing. And monitoring invertebrates is quite challenging, but there are a couple of sort of national recording sort of surveys out there that you could do. The UK Pollinator Monitoring Scheme, which is also known as POMS, is perhaps the one of the better ones to recommend. So you can do what they call FIT counts, which are flower insect time counts, where you simply sit and watch flowers, and you basically count the number of insects that visit a particular flower from a list of 14 target flowers that they give you. And you just kind of record the number of different insects that visit the flower you're looking at within a 10-minute period. And you can do these FIT counts anywhere. So you can do them, literally anywhere from an urban meadow through to your garden or anywhere else. And they can be done between April and September. I believe it's to the end of September. And then they have to be done, though, during sort of warm and sort of dryish weather. And I think a temperature needs to be about sort of above 13 degrees. But they're very simple to do, and that's all you're doing is just counting the number that visit, and you don't really kind of need really any sort of in-depth knowledge really, apart from just being able to separate a bumblebee from a hoverfly and that sort of more basic level insect identification skills. But they do have an app now, which is really quite handy if any of you have got smartphones, but the website there is there as well, ukpoms.org.uk. There's a lot of information on there. There's a lot of resources on there will tell you how to differentiate between different different insects that they want you to count. But that's quite a handy one. You could just do it any time, and you could kind of do that as many times as you want, I suppose, and just see how it changes over time, and whether you see any change in the number of insects, or maybe even the groups of insects that visit your meadow. Another one is the Bee Walk scheme, which is a national recording scheme run by the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. And this is basically set up to monitor bumblebees across the UK. And you basically follow a route. This is the same route every time, or what we call a transect. And it's done basically once a month between March and October. And you count the number of bumblebees you've seen, but also the species of them and the caste as well, whether they're male, female, or queens. So you need to have quite a good knowledge of bumblebees, but the Bumblebee Conservation Trust do give quite a lot of training, and there's quite a lot of courses going on every year on bumblebee identification. So it is an opportunity to learn. And in many places, you'll be lucky to get more than the common 8 sort of species of bumblebee anyway. But that's kind of worth looking into. And then another one is the Big Butterfly Count, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. They're run by the Butterfly Conservation Trust, Butterfly Conservation, and it's basically aimed at assessing how the environment is doing through the number of butterflies we see of different species. And basically it's a set time every year. It tends to be sort of around mid-July through to about early August, where they ask people to do these big butterfly counts, and you choose a spot, and it can be literally anywhere. So it could be a meadow that you own or manage. And you basically just count the number of butterflies and some moths as well in a 15-minute period, and then submit your results really online or through the app. And that can be a really useful thing going forward, but it's just that one time in the year that you kind of do that. So it might be a nice additional thing going forward, but you might want something a bit more regular, like the Bee Walk, or something else really to kind of get that data, like the fit count. Or you kind of may wish to kind of do your own sort of survey. So you might just want to kind of get out and do a little bit of recording yourself. And you might want to create, do your own little baseline survey, or if you've got the money, you could, pay an entomologist to do an in-depth survey beforehand and kind of try it again 10 years later or something along those lines. They're basically whatever kind of suits you best. But, there's a lot of resources out there to help you identify different invertebrates now. And there's some amazing books. So a really good book is one by Paul Brock. Well, there's 2 books by Paul Brock, and they're both really excellent guides to insects and sort of other invertebrates in the UK. But as well as that, there's a lot of online resources as well. So there's a lot of websites, but in particular, there's some really good Facebook groups. So if any of you are on Facebook, there's various groups depending on where you are in the UK. So down in the southeast, you've got things like the South East Wales Biodiversity Record Centre. They've got their own Facebook group where it's quite active, and you can get help with identification and things like that. If you're in Gwent, then you'll be Gwent Naturalists and Gwent Nature Spotters, but there's also West Wales one that covers Pembrokeshire and Carmarthenshire. And then, there'll be other ones then for, Ceredigion and North Wales and that sort of thing. So there's always a Facebook group for wildlife recording wherever you really are. And they're just excellent places for just post pictures to and ask what you're looking at, or if you want help, or just to learn from, really. But there are also these national pages as well. So you've got things like the beetles of Britain and Ireland, and the UK bees, wasps and ants, UK hoverflies, UK diptera, and many, many more as well, where you've got the proper UK experts. A lot of them are on these groups. Then you can get things checked, and get advice on anything you see. So you could literally just go around, take pictures of things you see, and try to get help with identifying them, and maybe over time build a bit of a species list and see how it changes. And just something to keep you occupied, I suppose. I do kind of realize that we're already on half 7. So I'll just really quickly, in like 5 minutes, just kind of go through just some of the species you might get in a meadow. So you might get things like buff-tailed bumblebee, which is one of our commonest bumblebee species that nests in old mammal burrows. This is one that might be using hedge banks around the edge of a meadow. Things like common carder bee, which is one of our commonest bumblebees, and they nest on the ground within tall vegetation. This is where tall grasses and scrub is really important for species like the common carder. You might have various solitary bees. So you might have things like Clark's mining bee, which is one of the ones that forages on willows and only collects pollen from willows or sallows. So that's where having some of these is really important within hedgerows or scattered willows. Also a wide variety of other solitary bees and things like ivy bee. That's where your ivy becomes really important. A specialist bee that only collects pollen from ivy. You might be really lucky, like some of the sort of Monmouthshire meadows, they have longhorn bees, which is really quite special bee, as you can see, with a really long antennae in the males. Quite a rare bee these days, but there are places in South Wales that you can get longhorn bees visiting meadows. Really beautiful thing. Really likes legumes like meadow vetchlin in particular. So if you encourage meadow vetchlin, then you're onto a bit of a winner and trying to encourage longhorn bee. But they also use a wide variety of other legumes as well, like burswick trefoil and things like that. Common blue, which feeds on common burswick trefoil, are common as blue butterfly, but a really stunning one that you get in quite a lot of meadows. You get a variety of moths as well, things like 6-spot burnet or narrow-bordered 5-spot and various other day-flying moths as well. That really quite stunning, but 6-spot is going to be quite a common one. Cinnabar, which is the one that feeds on ragwort, which is so important to maintain ragwort, and I'm sure many of you have seen the striped caterpillars. You get these cinnabar moths on ragwort, but a really beautiful day-flying moth. Again, you might get bee flies, which are developed within the nests of solitary bees. You might get these around hedge banks. They've got the solitary bee populations on areas of bare ground. You've got, tracks that go through a site, for instance. You might get hoverflies, such as the Batman hoverfly. So you can see that nice Batman logo there, which is almost perfectly matching the actual Batman logo, which is quite cool. And these develop in rot holes in trees. So this is where it's an important pollinator, but it develops in rot holes in trees. So this is where those older trees within hedgerows are important. You kind of see that relationship between some of these insects and how they require other habitats other than just the meadow as part of their life cycle. You might get things like snail killing flies, like this one, which are quite common in, but this one actually targets sort of terrestrial slugs and snails, but some of them they tend to be more aquatic. So you get them more around wetland habitats, but this one you'll get in drier areas. You might get beautiful things like the swollen-thighed flower beetle, also known as Cwrs Chwilod beetle because of the big, massive thighs. If you know Cwrs Chwilod, the cyclist, really common pollinator, but probably one of the more important beetle pollinators. We get things like longhorn beetles, which develop in dead wood, but they need to visit flowering trees and shrubs and flowering plants in meadows when they're adult. Things like bracken chafers, it can be really quite numerous in summertime. Dock beetle, so your meadow might have docks and you might think that's a bad thing, but dock is a really important plant that's home to quite a large number of different species rely on dock. And you get things like these really beautiful dock beetles that, although they're common, they are quite stunning as well. And you can kind of look for the lovely orange eggs them underneath the dock leaves. So having some dock as well is important. So basically try not to think too much about the bad influence of ragwort and thistles and dock that is often sort of passed down through generations, and they're really important for invertebrates. So if you can try to keep some of them, then it's really good going forward. So apologies we overran slightly, but I hope that was useful, and I think we'll stop and have some questions now.